So just to kind of put together things that we've been looking at in different areas but are taking place in the same time or roughly the same time, both the Greeks along with the Israelites and Judeans really rose up out of the ashes of the Bronze Age collapse. They really rose up during the Iron Age. And it's possible that the Israelites got a little bit of a head start on the Greeks, but it really was the 8th century, the 700s, that both cultures got going. Now, as we're going to see, unlike the Israelites, the Greeks didn't create kingdoms. They set up city-states that were governed by aristocratic councils. During this Archaic age, we're going to see a whole lot of what we call oligarchy. Oligarchy is just the rule of a few, and really it's the rule of the aristocrats, and the aristocrats are just the rich people. But having a city-state that has the concept of a group of rich people that are running the show is very different from a kingdom where the people are subject to a single person, subjects of the king. That just didn't happen in the Archaic Age of Greece. Now, like we saw in the last video, the early part of the Iron Age of Greece is called the Homeric Age, or the Heroic Age. This was a time of small villages and roaming groups of 100 or so people. Hierarchy and writing had disappeared. But I want you to take some time to think about the circumstances of these people's new condition. The fall of Mycenaean palaces and villages happened very quickly and very violently. Palaces and cities and villages were burned down, possibly by that group that we call the Dorians, who were close cousins of the Mycenaeans, close Indo-European cousins of the Mycenaeans. And within a generation, many places were completely abandoned. These people really felt and experienced that they were living in a dangerous world. And communities, whether they were small villages or roaming bands, still needed to protect themselves. It was wild times. It appears that most communities ended up looking towards what we call a basileus. This would be a strong, charismatic man that is able to convince people to follow him and is able to keep people in line physically and is able to defend his people physically. The term that anthropologists usually use when we look at societies, small societies that have some dude that is taking charge, we often call them a big man. But at least later Greeks used the term basileus, and this is a little weird. Basileus means king, but these dudes definitely weren't kings. They weren't passing down their role onto their sons. They had no official authority. Their authority came from what people chose to give them. Their authority came from being able to convince people to follow them, not just because there was some idea that that's just how things were, that the king was the owner of the law. But I want you to remember that Troy was destroyed just as the Bronze Age collapse was happening. And when Homer wrote about the Greek and Trojan War, he wrote about it in all of these scenes of individual heroes squaring off. And certainly if a city was destroyed, it was destroyed by an army, not just a few dudes fighting outside the walls. But more than likely, during this Dark Age, during this period of no writing, this Homeric Age, these basiles probably did square off in individual combat when different communities were bumping into each other. So Homer was probably taking a memory of the war with Troy that led to the destruction of that city, as well as the memory of all these individual big men that stuck out. And they got meshed together into what we call the Iliad. So if you're familiar with the battle between Achilles, who was a Greek, and Hector, who was a Trojan, this is whole battle that's just between two dudes and the gods that were helping them. That's not how most large-scale war works, but it probably is how those small-scale skirmishes worked during the Homeric Age. And there were still old Mycenaean cities that still existed, cities like Athens, but they were significantly reduced in size. Pottery and other tools were still being created, and there was still art taking place. A good example of that is this centaur right here that is found in Lefkandi, the Lefkandi centaur, made around the year 900 BCE, so still during this Homeric Age. So I don't want to give the information this was chaos, but this was much less organized than it was during the late Bronze Age. There was still some limited trade, and as the Fertile Crescent started to recover, trade did pick up. By the time we get to the 9th century, by the time we get to the 800s, Phoenicians were regularly trading in Greek harbors. And those Phoenicians made quite an impact. Remember, it's the Phoenicians who invented a completely phonetic alphabet, an alphabet where you could actually sound out words. No longer did you have to have scribes that had to memorize hundreds of symbols for all the different words. If we think about how things used to be in the Bronze Age, reading and writing was so complicated, it was a full-time job. It was like studying to become a doctor. And now that there's just a couple dozen symbols that allow for people to sound out words, and this of course made education that was necessary for reading and writing much less strenuous. So more folks could develop the skill. This is necessary for a society that's almost completely based on trade, like the Phoenicians were. Incidentally, you can almost think of the Phoenicians as being the heirs of the Minoans, even though those two civilizations don't have much crossover. Well, by the time we get to the 8th century, by the time we get to the 700s, Greeks had adopted their own version of the phonetic alphabet. This is why we have Homer and Hesiod writing their epic poems during this century. They took stories that had been being told by people throughout the heroic age and really codified them into set stories. And I'm not aware of any direct connection, but it is interesting that just around the same time that the Greeks were starting to write about their mythic histories, it's just about that time that the Israelites and the Judeans are doing the exact same thing. It's interesting how history can move in these parallels even when civilizations aren't directly affecting each other. At the same time as the Greeks were starting to learn how to write again, they experienced a population boom. This is what gave birth to the Archaic Age, which lasted from around the year 750 up until the year 479 BCE. An example of this, between the years 780 and 720 BCE, the Athenian population grew from somewhere around 2,400 people up to 10,000 people. It quadrupled in size in 60 years. Now, this may be due to increased trade, which leads to more food, which leads to less starvation, but the reasons for this boom are not totally clear. And it's during this time that many villages started joining together into something that is called a polis. The plural is polis. But a polis is a city-state. A polis is usually made up of an urban center and the surrounding fields and villages. An example of this, as you can see here, is the polis of Athens. This is made up of the city of Athens and then the entire land of what we call Attica that surrounds it. It's about 1,500 square miles. So the word polis means city, and it really is focused on the city of Athens. But that entire region that Athens is coordinating, collecting taxes on, passing laws for, putting militaries together to help defend that land, that all is also called Athens. It's all part of the Athenian polis. And it's important to recognize that, again, these polis weren't kingdoms. People living in them were not subjects to any king. They were citizens. Like I said, polis literally meant city, even though it included more than just a city. But another way you could translate this word polis would be to translate it as republic. Each of these cities were being set up as republics, filled with citizens. Now, each polis was independent. During the Archaic period, Greeks did not see themselves as a unified people. Each polis had its own take on the Greek mythology. Different regions of Greece had significantly different dialects. And polis that bordered each other often fought battles over land. But there was still some awareness of shared culture. Greeks had a word for people that weren't like them, barbaroi, which is where we get the word barbarians from. And this just comes from Greeks, particularly when they were looking at Persians and Medes, saying, I don't know, it just all sounds like they're saying bar to me. That's where the word barbarian comes from. And so with this somewhat sense of a unified identity, they did share mythology. Remember, Homer and Hesiod, they were read all across Greece. They weren't just read in Athens or in Sparta. And so while there were differences in mythological stories between different polis and different regions, Greek religion was somewhat unified. You're going to be reading up a little bit on the different Greek gods, but I want to touch on the religion a bit. It's similar to Bronze Age religions in that it's polytheistic. And just like many of those Mesopotamian and Egyptian religions, rituals were required to keep gods happy or if they wanted to ask favors from the gods. And definitely, like Mesopotamian religion, gods in Greece were not moral guides. They were part of this world, just like humans. They didn't create this world. Their ancestors had created. And just as human beings can be selfish and petty, so could Greek gods. So Greek religion itself was not about morality. It was all about ritual. Gods got upset when humans didn't perform the proper rituals, and that anger could be manifested in natural disasters or in bad luck. And again, we've seen this before. This is a common feature of many organized religions where you had a priestly class that said, well, you got to make sure that we have the ability to make the gods happy or bad things will happen. For Greeks, morality was really intertwined with winning. Winning was a sign that you had done all the things right. We'll talk a little bit more about this competitiveness in a bit, but competition was a central part of Greek culture. I do want to point out that Greek priests never had the type of power that priests in Egypt or in Israel had. There were no full-time jobs as priests, though many priesthoods were passed down through families. And it was poets, not priests, who ended up writing mythology. Secular power, the power of human beings, was always paramount in Greece. The idea that political power came from the gods just wasn't a very Greek idea. Political power came from winning. And again, this focus on competition and certainly some sense of united identity gave way to something that we call the Panhellenic Games. These are games that were open to all Greek men, and the Greeks called themselves Hellenes or Hellenes, so Panhellenic, across the Greek world. The very first of these Panhellenic Games that were ever created, the most prestigious of them all, were the Olympic Games, the games that were played at a place called Olympia. Now, according to later Greeks, the very first Olympic Games were played in the year 776 BCE, and archaeological records indicate that this might be correct. It certainly looks like people were playing some type of ritual games there since the 8th century. We'll come back to this image of Olympia in a second, but I want to make sure that we're aware of where everything's at. You need to know this place called the Peloponnesian Peninsula. It's that whole southern portion of Greece. The Olympic Games were played on the western region of the Peloponnesian Peninsula, a region called Elis, at a place named Olympia. And to be clear, Mount Olympus is in the northern portion of Greece in a place called Thessaly. So the Olympic Games were not played at Mount Olympus. As you'll see in a bit, Mount Olympus was the home of the 12 main gods of the Greek pantheon, of the Greek whole lists of gods. The top 12 lived at Mount Olympus. And these games weren't just entertainment. They were rituals meant to honor the gods. And in particular, at Olympia, the Olympics were meant to honor Zeus, the king of the gods. The winners of these games received olive wreaths or olive crowns. These were people that competed for recognition, not prizes. Athletes competed completely naked, and there were only winners. There are no second-place trophies in the ancient Greek games. For the most part, it was only aristocrats that could compete. It cost too much to hire trainers and take all the time to train and to travel. You had to be rich in order to partake in these games. Because again, nobody's getting paid to compete in the Panhellenic Games. Sometimes a polis or an individual patron might sponsor somebody that shows a lot of talent, but that was the exception rather than the rule. Now, originally at the Olympic Games, there was only one contest. It was a foot race. The race was called a stadion, or the length of it was a stade, because it was the length of a stadium. You can see the starting line here in the modern-day ruins of Olympia. The total length of the race was around 200 yards. But over time, more games were added. First, they added on a two-stade race, so you ran down and then you ran back. And then they added a two-stade race in armor. We'll talk more about the armor that the Greeks wore in a bit, but it weighed around 60 pounds and it was made of bronze, so it was pretty darn hot and heavy to run in. Boxing was eventually added. And ancient Greek boxing was pretty savage. There was no rules against hitting a man when he was down. There were no weight classes. They had a junior and a senior division. But you better get as big as you can, because featherweights are still going to be fighting against heavyweights in these boxing matches. Wrestling was eventually added. In ancient Greek wrestling, the rules were there was no biting allowed, no genital holds, of course no hitting, but you could break people's fingers. That was totally acceptable. There were chariot races, and as you can see, the people that were actually driving the chariot were clothed, but those folks were not considered to be competitors. It was the owner of the horses who won who got the olive wreath. The Pankration was essentially the mixed martial arts of the Greeks. It was a combination of boxing and wrestling. There were very few rules in the Pankration. You couldn't gouge somebody's eyes or ears or nose with your fingernails. You couldn't bite, but that was it. The Pankration was the most deadly of games to play besides racing. Chariot races were also pretty savage. And then there was the Pentathlon. This was made up of a race, and then throwing a discus, a javelin, and doing a long jump, and then it was completed by a wrestling match. Now, Olympia wasn't the only place these games were played at. Similar games were held all around Greece. Most games were just played in individual polis, so a polis would throw games for its own citizens to compete in. And those games actually usually came with expensive prizes. They could come with gold, or they could come with big vats of olive oil. And good olive oil was worth a lot back in that time. But it really was the 4 Panhellenic Games that held the most prestige. These were games that were meant only for Greeks, though in some cases outsiders did compete. And these games were arranged into 4-year Olympiad cycles. So each Olympiad began with the games in Olympia. The Olympics were played every 4 years, and again, the winners of each event were given an olive wreath or an olive crown. The second most prestigious games were the Pythian Games. They were played at Delphi. And they were played for Apollo every 4 years. So they were played 2 years after the Olympics. So you'd have the Olympics, 2 years later you'd have games at Delphi, and they would go back and forth like that, so they're each going every 4 years. The prize for the winner at the Pythian Games in Delphi was a laurel wreath or a laurel crown. And then the 2 more minor games, the Isthmus Games and the Nemean Games, they were played every 2 years, so they were always played in the years between the Olympic and the Pythian Games. And they were both played during those years. So both the Nemean and the Isthmian Games were played every 2 years. The Isthmus Games were played for Poseidon, and the winner got pine wreaths. And the Nemean Games were played for Zeus and Heracles. Again, you might know Heracles as Hercules. And those winners got wild celery wreaths. So again, coming out of the Homeric Age, even though the Greeks were not a unified people, there was some sense of a unified culture. There was also a unified sense of war. So remember, during the Homeric Age, there weren't armies. Battles were often between individuals or very small bands. And at some point near the end of the Homeric period or the beginning of the Archaic ages, we have the invention of something called the hoplon, which is the type of shield that the Greeks will become famous for. Before the hoplon, the Mycenaeans and many Greeks during the Dark Ages used these clunky figure-8 shields. But hoplons could be used for defense and for attack. A hoplon was a round wooden shield. It was about 3 feet in diameter. It was reinforced with a bronze rim, and it weighed about 15 pounds. The shield itself had a loop in the middle where the arm would go through all the way up to the elbow, and then a handle on the edge. And so they could move that shield around using the arm. Think of the Captain America shield. That is a hoplon. That is something that you can not just use for blocking, but you can use for pushing and punching. And this shield was so central to the Greek system of war, Greek soldiers were called hoplites. They got their name from their shield. But hoplites also wore a helmet and breastplate and greaves, which are just essentially shin guards. All of this was made of bronze. All together, this weighed 60 or more pounds. Nobody had been armored like this before in history. These were the first heavy shock troops. We'll see similar things with like knights during the medieval period that are all armored up, but this was really something new, this idea of wearing so much armor. It turned them into almost miniature tanks. The main weapon of a hoplite was a spear. Not a spear that was thrown, but a spear that was used for jabbing. And their backup weapon was an iron short sword. Now, in this early Archaic period, during the 8th and the 7th century, there were still plenty of self-sufficient farmers. that because they were able to support themselves, they could even make enough to buy their own armor. Though one of the things that made it possible for these more middle-class folks to get their hands on armor is that, unlike the Mycenaeans, who would bury their weapons and armor with dead warriors, when these middle-class farmers that owned their own land, when they passed on, they passed their armor down to their sons. And so families could build up armor over generations. And this armor was important stuff. A full suit of armor is called a panoply of armor. And so for a full panoply for a hoplite would be those greaves, that breastplate, a helmet, and the hoplon. And these things would be kept above the hearth, essentially on the mantle, on the wall above the fire. This was possibly the most prized possession of any of these Greek farmers. But as populations continued to grow in this population explosion of the early Archaic Age, fathers had less and less land to give to their sons. Because with each generation, that land gets broken up into smaller and smaller bits. And this land shortage really required communal solutions. Now, one of the solutions that the Greeks came up with was borrowed from the Phoenicians: colonization. Just as the Phoenicians had colonized the southern portion of the Mediterranean basin, starting in the 730s BCE, Greek cities, Greek polis, started sending out colonists to settle in other places. Now I want to be clear, the settlement that was sent out, it was an independent polis. It wasn't a building of an empire. That polis didn't have loyalty, or at least it didn't pledge allegiance to its mother colony, which was called a metropolis. In ancient Greek, metro just means mother, so the mother city was the metropolis. There were still connections. Quite often, colonists got to maintain the right of citizenship, so if they wanted to go back to their original polis, they were allowed to. They would definitely trade and have special relationships that way, and even in war, they often would side with each other. They all came from the same metropolis, or the same mother city, and the mother city quite often would help to protect its colonies. But they were not all underneath the same government. Each polis still had a totally independent government. So you can imagine the Archaic Age is this period of tiny Greek republics scattering all throughout the northern Mediterranean and almost the entire shoreline of the Black Sea. Sometimes these colonists were volunteered, sometimes they were conscripted, so people drew lots, and if you got the wrong one, you had to leave. But this is how Greek culture became so highly influential throughout the Mediterranean. This is part of the reason why Rome eventually will become so Greek. Sending people away to settle new lands was one way of dealing with the loss of land, but another solution was war. At some point in the early Archaic Age, the citizens of various polis started training themselves to fight in tight formation in something that's called a phalanx. And I had said a moment ago that those hoplites were like little tanks, but if you put a whole phalanx together, if you take a bunch of hoplites, you put them in tight formation, and then you have the front rank of that formation lock their shields, layer their shields one on top of the other to create a wall of shields in this very heavily armored group of people. Well, now you really do kind of have a tank. You have a heavily armored unit that is very difficult to penetrate. So a phalanx was a group of middle-class and aristocratic Greeks from a polis, all the people that could afford the hoplite armor. And again, even though we're now the middle class involved and it's not just the rich, this is very different from how militaries work in the modern day. Militaries in the modern day are quite often staffed not exclusively, but many people coming from the working classes. At this point in history, it was the people that had money that could actually arm themselves that were the main warriors in society. Now, the way these Greek battles worked, they were pretty darn ritualized. The two sides would meet on a pitch or on a flat field, quite often setting up camp so that they could start early in the morning. And before the battle, each city's phalanx would set up on each side of this pitch. Their generals would give speeches, their priests would make sacrifices to the gods, and quite often there would be a little bit of drinking involved. This is some pretty intense combat they're going to go into, and having a little bit of a buzz on made it a lot more doable for many of the troops. Once all of these opening rituals were done, competing phalanxes would run at each other. And when they finally hit, when they collided, they engaged in something called othismos, the pushing. And remember, they have these shields that they can use while they still have their other arm available for stabbing. And remember, their primary weapon was not a sword, it was a spear. The whole idea was, as you're trying to push that other side away or push your way through, you would be stabbing with this spear. There's only a couple places that hoplite armor really had exposures. One was at the neck, the other was at the genitals. And so those were the two areas that hoplites were usually stabbing at. This othismos, this pushing, was so intense that it was not uncommon for people in the front ranks to get crushed. Part of the reason why the phalanx is not just one wall of people. It's not just so that if somebody falls, the person behind them can take up their place, but you want to have enough people behind that you can push the other side off of the field. Because hoplite armor and hoplite phalanxes in particular are almost impenetrable from the front, but from the rear, a phalanx is incredibly vulnerable. Because think about it, they're already all packed in. If you can get behind a phalanx, you can cause massive damage before they can regroup. And so what was happening during the othismos was they were trying to punch a hole in the other phalanx. If you could get to the other side of a phalanx, that phalanx was destroyed. It would not be able to work the way it's supposed to work. And so usually what happened at that point is the other side ran. Really, that's the entire point of these battles, was to make the other side run off of the field. Now, this is ritualized. That pitch, that field, that's what we're fighting over. This was not a matter of trying to outmaneuver multiple armies. This was ritual warfare. Once one of the sides ran off the field, the victory was not completed until the victors raised something called a tropion. Once the losers had ran away, the victors would strip all the dead enemies of their armor. Remember, this hoplite armor is pretty expensive. You want to be able to bring that home. And one of the panoplies of an enemy, that entire set of armor, was mounted on a stake, which was then planted on the field. So you would essentially have this big stake with a suit of armor along with the spear and the hoplite. It almost looked like a crucified man, but it wasn't a person up there. It was the armor itself, the panoply of armor. Once that tropion had been raised, that was the declaration that that side had won. And to be clear, that word tropion, that's where we get the word trophy from. They raised their trophy to signify victory. And these wars were usually over claims to land. So raising a tropion over land was a way of saying, this is now ours. So all of this creation of culture is crucial for understanding the Greeks. You have to know about Homer and Hesiod beginning to codify mythology, and that emphasis on competition, which was then used to honor the gods and was used as a morality system. The creation of the polis with citizens who were not subjects, and the perfecting of this incredible power of hoplite phalanxes. You need to understand all that in order to understand the Greeks of the classical age that we are rapidly moving towards now. But in order to understand the great achievements of that age that's going to come after the Archaic age, we really need to understand how politics developed. It is worth noting that the word politics itself comes from the word polis. Now, with these larger populations that had come along with the population boom of the early Archaic age, there was a need for more social organization. One Basilius, one big guy who's used to managing 200, 300, maybe 1,000 people in a village, cannot organize a polis of 10 or 20 or 30,000 people. You need teams of folks. So in most of these polis, basilis would start relying on different families to help them out. And what ends up happening over time is those other families say, why do we have a basilius at all? Why do we have this one leader? We got this covered. That's what really defines the Archaic age, this aristocratic revolution, where the upper classes of each polis start to have an invested interest in running the polis and running the polis as well as they can. So by the time we get to the 7th century, by the time we get to the 600s, in most polis, there were elite families that distributed the public offices amongst themselves, and then they would rotate those offices. It was kind of an honor system. So this year, that family is going to be in charge of being generals, and that family is going to be in charge of being judges, and that family is going to be in charge of organizing all construction in the city. And next year, we'll all switch. This is how early Greek polis governments worked. And those aristocrats were making tons of money. By the time we get to the 7th century again, the top 10% own about 1/3 of all the land. And in addition to that 1/3 of all the land, they usually extracted about 1/6 of everything that those free farmers were making for what, they would call, quote, protection money. If people couldn't pay for their taxes or this protection money, they could become enslaved or they could become enserfed. We'll talk about those serfs later, but it's essentially like being a slave. It's also during the 7th century that the earliest identifiable poets start appearing, where we actually start getting Greek poetry. And those poets all make copious use of what we call elitist terminology. So terms that were used to describe any part of this aristocratic class, they were always described as beautiful and good and brave. But anytime commoners would show up in poetry, they were always described as ugly, bad, or cowardly. And you may be familiar with this in our own language. Think about the medieval period. Who were the upper class? The nobility, the nobles. And what do we mean when we say that's such a noble pursuit? We mean good. And medieval villagers were called villains, which has come down to us as a bad person. This is what happens when the aristocrats are in total control of a society. They don't just control all of the resources, they control the culture as well. Now remember, each polis developed independently, so this aristocratic revolution took different shape in different city-states. In Sparta, a mixed constitution was created. We'll talk about this in another video, but Sparta ended up with 2 kings and a council of elders and an assembly of all the citizens that got to vote on decisions that were presented by the elders. So you still kind of had basiles, and you still definitely had aristocrats, and you kind of had this idea of everyday citizens having a control over things. In Corinth, the aristocrats reigned supreme through almost the entire history of Corinth. And of course, Athens would eventually work its way towards democracy. But in all of these places, it was an aristocratic revolution that sparked this motion. We will be discussing this aristocratic revolution in the next video, which will then move us into the classical age of Greece.